Thank you so much to the Forum for Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policies and the Macroeconomic Policy Institute for this invitation. And of course, special thanks to Sebastian and to Celine for dealing with my virtual participation. So as Sebastian said, I am an international law scholar, not a macroeconomist. So I make my apologies in advance for anything that is lost in translation as I move forward. So I'm going to talk about environmental justice and the global south in the context of the socio-ecological transition. So I should start with some terminology so that you know what I mean when I say global south and environmental justice. So the term global south is used interchangeably with developing, less developed, underdeveloped, and in the past also third world, to refer to the states and peoples that are marginalized in international society, that are lagging behind in terms of prosperity, but also in terms of power. So the states of the global south have sometimes formed political movements, the G77, the non-aligned movement in the past, and the peoples of the global south have also been loosely linked at various times by social movements of protest by the poor against the rich. So the term global south has contemporary purchase, but of course its Cold War antecedent was the term third world. And so Nair describes the third world as the majority of the world's population, possessing the largest part of certain important raw materials, and yet having no control and hardly any influence over the manner in which the nations of the world arrange their economic affairs. So by the late 20th century, when states like South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong successfully developed export-oriented processes of industrialization, analysts declared that we no longer need this term, there's no third world anymore. And, the rapid economic growth today of Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Russia, South Africa, and other emerging economies raises similar issues today when we use a term like a global south. So using a term like global south does risk this impreciseness, the illusion of a very diverse group of states and this evolving, reshaping constantly of the alliances between them. So Hart and Negri famously said that globalization has made the third world obsolete, as there's a first world in every third world and a third in the first, and the second almost nowhere at all. So why do people use this term? Why am I using this term? Terms like third world and global south retain their political and scholarly purchase today because they have an enduring relevance for peoples across geographical and social cultural divides. People everywhere continue to be drawn together by these shared concerns for the poorest and most vulnerable people in their societies, by common struggles against global and transnational systemic patterns of domination and subordination, and by finding a usefulness in working together. So the usefulness of a term like global south lies in the way that it's used. So post-colonial scholars, of which I am one, use these to break down dichotomies rather than to reinforce them. So we're not asserting that there's an inflexible boundary between the North and the South. Rather, we're contesting the stability of such meanings and identities. Because post-colonial scholars understand colonialism as a project of cultural control, colonized societies were classified and labeled, and the distinctions were created not only oppositions between colonizers and colonized, but between Europe and Asia, Europe and Africa, modern and primitive, West and East, North and South, and so on. So as Upendra Bakshi observed, these categories were never pure categories. And long before Hart and Negri identified globalization as scrambling the composition of the three worlds in 2000, hundreds of years of scrambling had already occurred through centuries of colonialism, settlement colonies, enforced diaspora of laborers, slavery, slave-like labor, and forced relocation. So I use the term global south because it has this flexible, porous meaning that enables a reference to transnational underclasses, transnational movements and transnational solidarities that are in a process of continual geographical flux. And certainly the term global south has its pitfalls, and unfortunately all the alternatives do too, but it can be useful because it is helpful in counter-hegemonic knowledge production. It provides what Philip Darby calls a conceptual tripwire against colonizing tendencies of dominant discourse. So environmental justice is a term that has a much more precise origin. It began in the United States in the 1980s when it was used to describe the unequal impact of industrial pollution on racial minorities. Environmental justice is a response to environmental racism, the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. And beyond race, environmental justice encompasses also issues of class, gender, sexuality, and other intersectional markers that are used to marginalize people. So given the origins of environmental justice in the heartlands of the long industrialized United States, and the US has its very particularities of race and class in the US, it may seem surprising that the concept of environmental justice is taken up across the global South. But the connections become evident when considering the indivisibility of US economic development from the exploitation of labor and resources worldwide. The US particularities of race and class were produced by the centuries of settler colonialism, the genocide of the indigenous populations, slavery and forced labor, apartheid, and access to labor and resources across the globe, and of course, environmental degradation. So when the summit, the pictures that I'm showing you here, the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, formulated the principles of environmental justice in 1991, they explicitly acknowledged this link across time and space, the historical link and the geographical link, stating that they are gathered together to build a national and international movement of all peoples of color to fight the destruction and taking of our lands and communities, to respect and celebrate each of our cultures, languages, and beliefs about the natural world, and our role in healing ourselves. And to secure our political and economic and cultural liberation that has been denied for over 500 years of colonization and oppression, resulting in the poisoning of our communities and land and the genocide of our peoples. So environmental justice movements stem from centuries of environmental degradation. Because of colonization and the oppression of communities of color worldwide, communities that carried the burden of Western industrialization through the loss of their lands, their livelihoods, and their lives so that elites can profit. And importantly, these principles take into account the impossibility of homogeneity across such a wide variety of people, declaring that solidarity can't be built on solidarity can only be built on celebrating the diverse understandings of nature that they have and different roads to self-healing. Rather than subsuming the contradictions and diversity and focusing on commonality, environmental justice is defined through multiplicity rather than unity, ensuring that it remains a useful idea for local communities worldwide that often face challenges that are very unique, that may have no parallels or very limited parallels in other places and times, and also local experiences with environmental harm that are often very much in flux. So we have these two concepts, environmental justice and global South, that are both based on an awareness of patterns of exploitation that are long-standing and that are transnational, and so the need then for transnational solidarity. So environmental justice advocates identify four aspects of environmental justice that are experienced by historically marginalized communities. The first is distributive justice, which is the distributive injustice, which is a disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards and the disproportionate access to environmental services. The second is procedural injustice, the exclusion from environmental decision-making. The third is corrective injustice, the unequal enforcement of laws and redress for harms done. And social injustice, which is the intertwining of environmental harm with deeper structural ills like poverty and racism. So I'm going to talk about each of these briefly in terms of its relevance for socio-ecological transition. I'm going to spend most of my time on the first one. Procedural and corrective injustices are, of course, what lawyers tend to focus on, but I think for a forum on macroeconomics, I'm going to focus more on the first issue. So distributive justice identifies transnational patterns of environmental winners and losers, and correlations with race, culture, class, gender, and other markers of inequality. So before doing that, it's probably worth just recalling briefly the scale of some of the environmental problems that we're talking about. So the last time there was this much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere was 3.5 million years ago, where amid most likely the onset of the sixth mass extinction of species for the first time in 66 million years. and the biggest disruption to the Earth's nitrogen cycle in 2.5 billion years. So the question is, who has caused these problems? So the simplest way to put this is that the richest 20% of the world consumes 80% of its natural resources and generates over 90% of its waste. So environmental problems are caused almost exclusively by rich people. And to solve them, the rich have to, of course, change their behavior. So to briefly illustrate the scale of the inequity, I draw on climate change just because it is what everyone talks about nowadays. So we have the United Kingdom, 66 million people emitting as much carbon dioxide as Nigeria, Pakistan, Morocco, and Peru together with 475 million people. We have California, one state in the United States with 39 million people that emits the same amount as the 880 million people in the 50 poorest countries in the world. And we have Texas and New Jersey with a combined population of 37 million people that emit as much carbon dioxide as the 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. So we are talking about inequality on a massive scale, and on such a scale, it can't be a coincidence, it's not happenstance, it is systemic. So we have an economic system that ensures that the rich not only stay rich, but get richer, and most of them, of course, still remain in Europe and North America. And the poor, most of whom are in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean, contribute very little to environmental problems, but they are on the forefront of environmental harm because of their vulnerable geographic locations, the lack of resources and regulatory capacity to protect themselves, the ongoing extraction of their resources and labor to fuel an unequal economy, and the systemic transfer of pollution from the rich to the poor. So, because environmental burdens are borne by others, there is no immediate incentive for the rich to change their behavior. There's a disjuncture between those responsible for harm and those who experience it, which is, of course, incredibly unjust, but it's sadly proven to be very sustainable for rich people so far. So, distributive justice focuses on commonalities and interconnections between disempowered communities within rich and poor states to reconfigure where the global south is. That is this transnational and evolving place where solidarity can be built between lower class communities in poor and in rich states. When extended globally, then environmental justice, unlike in its US origins, is no longer about disproportionately impacted minority communities. It highlights the alignment of the league interests across the North and South and the enrichment of the powerful few at the economic and environmental cost of the vast majority. Because, of course, as we well know, the political and economic elites in the global South did replicate colonial practices in post-colonial states. They disenfranchised local populations, they controlled and exploited their natural resources and labor, and we have well-known examples of metropole enrichment, including corporate land grabs in India that disproportionately impact lower caste peasant and tribal populations, and in China, the oppression of ethnic groups in the mineral-rich western regions in Tibet and Xinjiang, and similarly in Indonesia and the eastern regions of Kalimantan and Papua. So distributive justice movements across the global South often have in common these alliances between the rural and the urban poor. So we have farmers and peasant and fisher folk and the urban working poor, and indigenous and tribal groups and environmentalists who work together and mobilize in opposition to the equally strong, if not stronger, collaboration between central governments, local monopoly capital, and transnational capital. And such movements, they don't just oppose the environmental impact of industries, but the export-oriented growth model pursued by the state and encouraged by international financial institutions, because that was the type of development that had long exploited their resources and cheap labor to benefit local elites and pay the international debts. So the other reason why distributive justice has been useful to the environmental justice movement is that it helps combat the tendency to shift environmental problems around and to shift responsibility across national borders. So some examples of this include market mechanisms like the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, under the Kyoto Protocol, the REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, carbon trading and emissions trading schemes that allow the rich to pay the poor to take environmentally responsible actions on their behalf so that they can maintain their carbon-intensive lifestyles. So the global north, of course, has long been relocating its polluting facilities and exporting its hazardous waste to the south. And South Korea and Taiwan did similarly relocated their polluting industries to mainland China and Southeast Asia. And within states, or the distributive inequities that triggered the US environmental justice movement still persist 4 decades later, not just in the US, but all over the world. We do have the tendency to put environmentally noxious land use in poor and marginalized communities. And they are, of course, very regressive schemes that are the consequence of when an economic system rewards exploitative practices instead of disincentivizing them. So distributive justice is basically calling for, don't just move the problems around, ask those who cause them to actually produce the remedy and not, use their ill-gotten gains to pay someone else to do it for them. And it asks for convergence between the ecological footprints of the rich and the poor. And it also, importantly, redirects the focus of development policymakers from their, obviously, long-standing obsession with transforming the developing world, asking them to focus instead on transforming those transnational structures that produce and maintain patterns of inequality and environmental degradation across poor and marginalized communities everywhere. So the rich who overconsume and overpollute are in the limelight, with their progress monitored and scrutinized, classified with indicators, calculated, all of that, reversing the development industry's fixation with the global south for data collection and reform projects there. And it's useful because we have concepts like the Anthropocene gaining a lot of currency now. So the Anthropocene, of course, denotes the current geological age as a period where human activity is the dominant influence in the environment. And distributive justice helps make the point that, of course, humanity is not responsible for environmental damage on a planetary scale, only a very small proportion of it. So it resists, environmental justice in general helps resist the trend in many disciplines, certainly my own, certainly in international law and in international environmental law, towards very increasingly technical environmental specialization as a means of concealing our failure to protect the environment and obfuscating where our real commitments lie. So as I said, to get to the other 3 aspects of environmental justice, procedural justice and corrective justice are of greatest interest to lawyers such as myself, but I will not dwell on it too much today. Suffice to say, procedural justice, of course, foregrounds the procedures that underlie the distributive outcomes to show why certain communities tend to always come out on the losing side of environmental decision-making. Northern states, of course, set the parameters of how decisions are made. Who is considered a person? Who is considered a state? What counts as law? What counts as justice? What does environmentalism look like? To participate in decision-making on environmental matters, the rest of the world has to fit into Northern answers to these questions. Otherwise, we, of course, will not be accepted or heard or in fact understood. So such parameters undermine diverse forms of social groups, diverse forms of community organization, diverse understandings of what human development is, and diverse relationships with the natural world. Because to participate in environmental decision-making, we must speak in a language that is not our own, both metaphorically and literally. So the problem there, of course, is that environmental crises confront us very much with the limits of Western knowledge production, because the systemic destruction of ecosystems is one of the legacies of the European Enlightenment. So we do desperately need new paradigms to better understand the natural world and the place of humans in it. So if we were to have a procedurally just system, that would be open to different worldviews. Not just a specialized technocracy that only those with elite training can access. Such an evolution is not only just, but it fosters the type of imaginative thinking that produces real solutions to ecological change. Instead of real solutions, we, of course, instead have the tendency to utilize economic incentives as we turn to the green economy and green growth to solve environmental crises in hopes that capitalism can simultaneously solve the problems that it creates. And many of these so-called green solutions, from biofuels to electric vehicles, from carbon offsets to carbon trading, are creative ways to fuel economic growth, but don't really stand up to scrutiny when it comes to environmental protection. And they do, of course, provide new markets for capitalists to expand and diversify, enabling further enrichment, and it allows environmentalism to be captured by the rich. So when it comes to corrective justice, you will not be surprised to hear that redress for environmental suffering, whether in the past, now, or in the future, has proven fairly elusive. So I'm just going to talk about the very extreme case of small island developing states where climate change has destroyed ecosystems, livelihoods, and in some cases entirely engulfed islands under rising seas. So in such situations, of course, they can't survive without help. But help has not come, not from rich states, despite promises to do so. And these promises are always framed in the language of charity and largesse, or worse still, as loans, rather than in the discourse of causation and responsibility and reparations. And in any case, even if the money promised ever did come through, it's hard to imagine loss on this scale being corrected with financial compensation alone, because what is lost is self-determination, sovereignty, independence, dignity, and that's what needs to be restored. I think the predicament of small island developing states is I'm taking one of the most stark examples, but in reality, displacement from environmental change is much more widespread and much more gradual. Not always that noticeable, but it's massive and it's protracted. So the median projection is that approximately 200 million people will be displaced, but there is uncertainty on that number. And that number is for climate. So it doesn't include those displaced by other forms of environmental degradation, such as non-climate related desertification, deforestation, pollution, development-induced displacement, and so on. So while monetary remedy can compensate to a limited extent, in the long term, environmental change is reconfiguring the habitable zones of the planet. And in the past, when that happened, people, just like other animals, adapted by moving. But today, rich states don't allow people to move freely, even in times of great peril. And of course, we know that currently rich states are strengthening their border controls. So one form of corrective justice for environmentally and developmentally induced displacement could include a requirement that displaced populations be given sovereign self-determination elsewhere, including in territories of responsible states. And this would not only ensure that rich states take responsibility for the transboundary harm they cause, but it provides displaced people with the opportunity to create a new, a dignified home. Well, of course, reparations were never provided to the global South for colonialism or genocide, or slavery or apartheid or other destructive practices. So environmental justice calls for a change from the unaccountable and irresponsible patterns of the past in international relations to providing remedies for environmental harms. Now, the fourth aspect, social justice, understands environmental harm as part of the long-standing social struggles against practices that impoverish the South to empower the North. The high proportion of ecological harm in the South is the result of export-oriented production rather than domestic consumption, and it stems from the transnational corporate quest for southern resources and labor. And when that happens, poor people often don't feel like they have a choice, but they have to accept the risks of pollution, toxicity, and other environmental harms. Communities that are beset by a multitude of harrowing problems might see safety from violence or economic security as a much more immediate priority and easier to organize around. Whereas complex, latent environmental risks may seem like luxury concerns or else just too complex and difficult to address, provoking this kind of hopelessness. So to overcome these systemic barriers to action, social justice provides an understanding of economic and ecological concerns as interlinked and best addressed together. It's a reminder that environmental harm in marginalized communities is inextricable from the socio-economic processes that construct their disenfranchisement. And so their solutions have to be holistic. So the emphasis on the inextricability of ecological and economic choices is particularly crucial given the growth of the circular economy. So if we have schemes that the rich are best positioned to profit from, whether through trading and offsets or through energy efficiency and green consumerism, or more cynically through disaster economies and reconstruction and climate insurance and things like that, all symptomatic of a global economic system that is so self-destructive that it profits from its own decay. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and hope I haven't gone over time or anything. Let me know, Sebastian.